Some nurses should stick to bedpans instead of pretending they understand medicine. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before the Navy showed up looking for a woman who officially died 15 years ago. St. Michael's ER in Savannah smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in that particular way that makes time feel negotiable. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered. Laura Bennett moves between beds with the efficient silence of someone trained to operate in hostile territory. 3 years she's worked here. 3 years of steady hands and chart documentation that never wavers, of codes where her voice doesn't crack and her fingers don't shake. Nobody notices the slight limp in her right leg, subtle as weather. Nobody notices how her jaw tightens when someone raises their voice, that single muscle memory of restraint. During quiet moments, her fingers drift to her scrub pocket, to a tarnished challenge coin worn smooth from 15 years of touching, of remembering, of not being allowed to remember. Room 12 holds a Navy SEAL named James Garrett, recently back from Bagram, his muscular frame taking up most of the hospital bed like he still doesn't fit inside civilian spaces. His dark eyes are confused, not scared, not yet, but tracking her with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation. On his forearm, tattooed in bold letters, is a name, Laura Bennett. He stares at it, then at her, his mouth moving like he's trying to place a stranger's face. The head injury did that. Took the memory and left only the scar tissue and the tattoo and the gratitude of someone who knows, on some level below consciousness, that this woman saved his life. He just can't remember how. Can't remember the 3 miles through enemy fire, can't remember her hands keeping pressure on a sucking chest wound, can't remember anything except that somewhere in his broken neural pathways, he owes her everything. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrives for morning rounds at 7:27 a.m., his white coat pressed sharp as a knife blade, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the cracked linoleum like a countdown. He's spent 5 years building the hierarchy of this ER brick by careful brick, making sure everyone knows exactly where they stand and that he stands above them. The residents trail behind him like planets orbiting a sun. He's 52, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that comes with money and the kind of cruel that comes from never being told no. His presence has a weight to it, the way a predator's presence changes the air pressure in a room. Bed 7, he says without preamble. Pneumothorax, admitted 6:15, Laura responds. She doesn't look up from the 4 line she's running. Breath sounds diminished on left, tracheal deviation starting at 2 centimeters. I can read the monitor, Nurse Bennett. His voice carries that particular edge, the one that makes everyone in a 3-bed radius suddenly very interested in their clipboards. Some nurses should stick to bedpans instead of pretending they understand medicine. The residents laugh. It's not loud, not aggressive, just the small sound of a pecking order being reinforced. One of them, a 3rd year named Morrison, actually looks uncomfortable, glancing away. But Caldwell doesn't care about Morrison's discomfort. He cares about the fact that Laura Bennett hasn't reacted. Not a flinch. Not a flush. Just continued running that 4 line with the same steady precision, as if he hadn't spoken at all. It irritates him more than tears would have. The team moves down the row. Bed 9 is a routine MI. Bed 11 is a drug overdose, 2nd time this month, and Caldwell makes a comment about repeat business that's unprofessional enough that even the residents exchange looks. Then they reach room 12. Petty Officer James Garrett is awake, his eyes tracking Caldwell the way a wounded animal tracks a predator, not with fear, but with assessment. There's something in his military bearing that doesn't dissipate even horizontal on a hospital bed, even with a concussion and a fractured C for vertebra. Head injury from an IED blast in Helmand Province, Laura says, positioning herself slightly forward, between the bed and the doctor. Her tone is neutral, clinical. Presented with GCS of 8, intubated in the field at forward operating base Shank. CT scan shows subdural hematoma, 7 mm, right temporal lobe. Neuroconsult recommends conservative management pending repeat imaging at 48 hours. Caldwell barely glances at the scans. He's stable. Move him to the step-down unit. Nursing can manage observation. His vitals are stable, Laura says, and this is where her voice changes, not louder, just lower, more precise. But his neurostatus is declining. The hematoma is borderline for surgical intervention. Repeat CT should happen at 24 hours, not 48. He's showing early signs of increased intracranial pressure. The room goes quiet. Not the polite quiet of a normal conversation ending. The quiet of a hierarchy being challenged. Caldwell's eyes find hers, and in that moment, something dangerous passes between them. He sees a nurse questioning his medical judgment. He sees a woman who knows too much, who moves with too much confidence, who carries herself like she's used to giving orders instead of following them. He sees a threat. Step down unit, he repeats. Nursing observation. Close call on the imaging. Doctor, Laura starts. That's an order. His voice is smooth, cultured, final. He turns away before she can respond, already moving to the next bed, his residents scurrying behind him like leaves in his wake. The rest of rounds passes like a held breath. Laura doesn't speak again. She checks vitals, updates charts, moves through the ER with the same mechanical efficiency, but her jaw is tight, and her fingers have found that coin again. She pulls it out during a rare quiet moment, standing in the break room that smells like microwave popcorn and someone's tuna sandwich from last week. The coin is worn almost smooth, the eagle barely visible on one side, the trident scarred and faded. 23 years. It's been 23 years since someone called her by her rank, since anyone knew her name was more than just the name on her badge. Back in room 12, Petty Officer Garrett stares at the name on his arm again, touching it with his fingertips like maybe if he presses hard enough, the memory will surface. It doesn't work. Memories don't work that way. Some things are erased by the body, some by the mind, and some by orders from people in buildings that don't appear on any map. 2 hours later, during the afternoon shift change, Laura finds Caldwell in the physician's lounge. She stands in the doorway, doesn't enter, maintains perfect professional distance. Petty Officer Garrett's neuro checks are deteriorating, she says. Heart rate elevated, response time slower, pupil slightly unequal on the right. Caldwell doesn't look up from his coffee. Your job is nursing, Bennett, not neurology. His Glasgow coma scale dropped 2 points in the last hour. Then call neuro if you're concerned. That's what the chain of command is for. Now he does look up, and there's something in his expression that's almost amused. You should know about chain of command, shouldn't you? Following it properly. She doesn't respond. She can't. Any response gives him ammunition. So she turns and walks back to the ER, her right leg carrying her without a limp because she won't allow herself that weakness, not here, not now, not in front of people who've already decided what she is. That night, in the shift wrap-up, a new document appears in Laura's personnel file. A formal performance review, submitted by Dr. Marcus Caldwell, citing concerns about insubordination and failure to respect chain of command and proper medical hierarchy. It's dated today. It's the first of what will become many. She holds the paper in her hands, just paper, just words, and her fingers find the coin again in her scrub pocket. Cold metal. Smooth from use. A thing that shouldn't exist, touched by a person who shouldn't exist, in a life that's supposed to be nobody at all. But the coin is real. The tattoo on Petty Officer Garrett's arm is real. And somewhere in the encrypted servers of a building that doesn't have a public address, there is a file that proves Laura Bennett was once something else entirely. Once someone important. Once someone the Navy lost on purpose, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is save the right person's life in the wrong country. The next words out of Caldwell's mouth, they would come in less than 24 hours, would light a fuse that ran all the way to the Pentagon. Grand rounds in the conference room smelled like stale coffee and the particular anxiety of residents who knew they were about to watch someone get eviscerated. Caldwell stood at the head of the table with Laura's patient notes in his hands like evidence at a murder trial, his voice dripping condescension so thick you could operate in it. Here we have Nurse Bennett's assessment, he said, holding the pages up to the fluorescent lights as if checking them for authenticity. 47 lines of differential diagnosis. 47. He turned to the assembled white coats with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, when exactly did St. Michael's start issuing medical licenses to bedside staff? The residents laughed on cue. 12 white coats chuckling in unison, a coordinated performance that had clearly happened before. Laura stood motionless against the back wall, her posture perfect, her breathing controlled. Only her jaw tightened, a single muscle contracting under skin that remained otherwise absolutely still. Her pen never stopped moving in her notebook. Document everything. Remain invisible. The same rules that had kept her alive in Bagram applied here. Make yourself smaller than your competence, quieter than your knowledge, less visible than your value. It was a language she'd been speaking for 3 years. Perhaps our friend here missed the lecture on scope of practice, Caldwell continued, drawing out a nickname with theatrical precision. Or maybe she thinks those online courses make her qualified to override physician judgment. He tossed her notes back onto the table like they were contaminated. The job of a nurse is to implement, not to innovate. To follow, not to lead. To know her place. The laugh lines around his eyes deepened as the residents responded with nervous energy, the kind of laughter that comes from relief. At least it wasn't them being dismantled in front of their colleagues. Laura's left hand found the challenge coin in her scrub pocket. Cold. Smooth. Real. She held it the way someone might hold a lifeline. 2 hours later, the vending machines hummed their mechanical song in the hallway outside the break room. Dr. Richards and Dr. Patel stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices pitched just loud enough for the entire corridor to hear what they were saying. Richards was gesturing with a half-eaten granola bar, his face animated with the kind of energy that comes from punching down. "Did you see Caldwell absolutely demolish that nurse?" he said. "The one who thinks she's a trauma surgeon? Bennett or whatever." Patel laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. She probably read a WEBMD article and decided she was a surgeon. Classic nurse hero complex. They were performing now, aware of the 2 interns hovering by the coffee station, aware of the power dynamic they were establishing. We are doctors, we are in control, we laugh at whoever falls. Laura rounded the corner carrying a coffee cup, her stride unchanged, her expression neutral as fog. She would walk past them without a flicker of acknowledgement. No pause. No reaction. Her coffee cup was still warm. She gripped it tighter and kept moving, though her fingers had gone white around the ceramic. It wasn't rage she felt. Rage was inefficient. What moved through her instead was something colder, the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst, from knowing that people like Caldwell were temporary obstacles in a much longer war. She didn't need him to respect her. Respect from a man like that would be a liability. What she needed was the coin in her pocket and the knowledge that something else was still out there, something that remembered who she actually was. That afternoon at the nurse's station, Caldwell cornered her while she was updating Petty Officer Garrett's chart. His approach was silent, he moved like someone accustomed to getting what he wanted without having to negotiate for it. His smile was surgical, precise, the kind of expression that made it clear he was doing this for an audience even though there wasn't one immediately visible. Laura felt the shift in air pressure as he positioned himself between her and the exit. "I've requested your performance reviews from the past 6 months," he said quietly, his voice designed to carry to anyone listening within 20 feet. "The board wants to discuss your pattern of insubordination and failure to respect chain of command. Security will escort you to those meetings, just so we're all clear about your position here." He waited, watching her face, looking for the crack he expected to see. The trembling. The tears. The collapse of composure that would confirm his narrative. Laura met his eyes and said only, "Understood, doctor," her voice flat as desert sand, smooth as worn stone. She turned back to the chart without breaking her pen's rhythm. Not a request for leniency. Not a defense. Not a question. Just a 2-word acknowledgement that required nothing from him and gave him nothing he could weaponize. His jaw tightened, the only moment where his mask slipped, before he walked away. He had expected resistance, expected emotion, expected her to fight back or beg or show him something he could use to justify what he was about to do. Instead, she had given him nothing. Just silence and the steady scratch of her pen on paper. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Petty Officer James Garrett lay in room 12 with her name tattooed on his forearm, and when Laura changed his foresight, he looked at her with polite, empty gratitude. His head injury had stolen something fundamental. The bullet that had lodged 2 millimeters from his visual cortex had erased the memory of the Master Chief Petty Officer who'd carried him 3 miles through Bagram's southeastern district with a collapsed lung and a wound that should have been fatal. He knew her face because it was familiar, but he didn't know her name. Didn't know that she'd applied direct pressure to his chest cavity with her own hands, that she'd counted down the minutes until the evac chopper was close enough to hear, that she'd sung to him actual songs, because he needed something to anchor to besides pain, while blood ran down her ribs and every breath felt like drowning. He smiled at her with the gentle courtesy of someone who'd been raised well, and it was worse than any insult Caldwell could have engineered. Worse because it was born of kindness. "Thank you for taking care of me," Garrett said, his eyes still clouded from the morphine. "You're a good nurse." "Just a nurse." The word settled on her shoulders like weight. She checked his vitals without expression, BP stable, O2 sat at 94%, heart rate regular, and told him to rest, her voice carrying the same professional distance she'd perfected over 3 years at St. Michael's. When she turned to leave, her fingers brushed the challenge coin again. Some people you saved, you lost. That was the equation. That was what she'd agreed to when she'd accepted this civilian life with a borrowed name and no past. The monitor screamed. Ventricular fibrillation, a wild, chaotic electrical storm thrashing across the screen in jagged peaks. Petty Officer Garrett's body convulsed once, twice, then went rigid as his heart stopped trying altogether. Asystole. The flat line. The silence. Laura was 3 rooms down, documenting vitals on a 64-year-old with pneumonia when the code alarm sounded. Room 12. She didn't run. She moved, the distinction mattered. Running was panic. Movement was purpose. Her feet crossed the distance in 8 seconds, muscle memory routing her through the corridor before her conscious mind fully registered the crisis. The unit alarm wailed like something wounded, a sound that had sent her through doorways in Bagram with rounds snapping past her ear and a Marine bleeding out in her arms. Garrett lay motionless on the mattress. His monitor displayed the irregular, desperate pattern of a heart that had given up. The resident, a third-year named Chen, stood frozen at the bedside, hands hovering uselessly over the patient's exposed chest. The nursing assistant had already called for help, but her voice had that hollow quality that meant she knew help might arrive too late. Laura didn't wait for authorization. She didn't wait for Caldwell. She moved to the crash cart and opened the thoracotomy tray with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this in worse conditions, in a Chinook helicopter with sandstorm visibility at 10 feet, in a fire-base bunker with mortar rounds walking closer, in a forward operating base where anesthesia meant pushing morphine and hope. 14-gauge needle, she said. Not a request. A statement. Chen's eyes widened. The doctor. Needle. Now. Her hands were already positioning the electrocardiography pads, already assessing the intercostal spaces along Garrett's ribs. The skin was cool, pale, the kind of pallor that meant his circulation had collapsed minutes ago. Her fingers found the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, a landmark her body remembered even though her mind had spent 15 years pretending she'd never studied anatomy at a level that civilians didn't even know existed. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from the tension pneumothorax, that sound was relief, was science, was a patient buying back his remaining seconds on Earth. The monitor changed. Rhythm shifting, becoming almost organized. Get me the scalpel, Laura said. Surgical blade. Now. The incision took 3 seconds. Her hand moved with the precision of muscle memory, cutting through skin with the kind of anatomical certainty that belonged to someone who'd performed emergency surgery in conditions where hesitation meant watching people die. Left anterolateral thoracotomy, 4th intercostal space. The textbooks called it a procedure requiring years of surgical training. The battlefields called it survival. Blood welled up, not a hemorrhage, but enough to confirm she was in the right place. Her gloved fingers found the pericardium, opened it with careful deliberation, and then her hand was inside Garrett's chest cavity, her palm cradling his heart. It was cold. Fibrillating. Dead weight in her hand. She began direct cardiac massage with the steady rhythm of someone who'd trained for this, drilled for this, who understood that a human heart in her hand was both the most fragile and most resilient organ she'd ever touched. Compression. Release. Compression. Release. The mechanical motion moving blood through vessels that had forgotten how to move it themselves. "Get me the defibrillator pads," she said. Her voice was steady. Calmer than the monitor. Calmer than the room. Chen moved. The nursing assistant moved. The attending physician, who'd been writing notes at the station, moved toward the room but stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to take over or let this woman with steady hands and military precision continue doing something that looked like surgery but didn't need a surgeon's name on the paperwork. 30 seconds of cardiac massage. Garrett's chest rose and fell with her compressions. The monitor was still showing chaos, but the chaos was becoming organized, becoming something that resembled rhythm. "Epi, 1 milligram, for push," she said. The medication went in. The waiting period that followed was the longest part, the pause where the drug traveled through the bloodstream and the universe held its breath. The monitor changed. Not sinus rhythm yet, but organized. Electrical activity coordinating, cardiac tissue remembering how to fire in sequence instead of panic. Laura's hand was still inside the chest cavity, feeling the faint flutter beneath her palm, the first tentative signs of a heart remembering its purpose. "Again," she said. "One more cycle. Compression. Release." The rhythm strengthening with each cycle, the monitor's display becoming less of a scream and more of a conversation between electrical signals that finally knew what they were supposed to be doing. Dr. Caldwell arrived as the rhythm converted to something close to normal. His face went through a series of expressions in rapid sequence, confusion, then awareness of what was happening, then something that looked like rage trying to find a shape it could fit into. His eyes moved from the monitor to Laura's hand, still inside Garrett's chest cavity, to the tray of instruments scattered across the bedside table like evidence of a crime, to the room full of staff who had watched a nurse perform a procedure that doctors spent for years learning. "Step back," Caldwell said. His voice was quiet. Controlled. Dangerous. Laura didn't move. She was watching the monitor, watching Garrett's vital signs stabilize, watching the oxygen saturation climb from the dangerous red of the 60s into the safer yellow of the 80s. 90. She withdrew her hand carefully, checked the pericardium one final time, and then looked at Caldwell with the same expression she'd worn during his morning humiliation, composed, attentive, waiting for instruction. "Close him up," Caldwell said to Chen. Then he turned to Laura. "My office. Now." She stripped the gloves with precise movements, dropped them in the biohazard container, and washed her hands at the sink while Caldwell stood in the doorway. The water ran clear. She'd gotten most of Garrett's blood off her hands. The traces that remained would linger in the creases of her palms, under her nails, embedded in the calluses that came from a life before this borrowed one in Savannah. The challenge coin felt heavier in her scrub pocket as she walked past Caldwell toward the exit. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't apologize. Didn't offer explanation. She simply moved, and that composure, that refusal to show him the victory of her concern, her fear, her understanding of what she'd just done, seemed to enrage him more than if she'd fought back. The corridor stretched ahead like a runway. The sound of her shoes on the linoleum was the only thing that broke the fluorescent-lit silence. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Caldwell's breathing getting faster, his footsteps quickening to catch up, his need to reclaim authority overriding his professional composure. She'd saved Garrett's life. She'd brought his heart back from electrical chaos using the kind of surgical knowledge that only existed in her classified file, in the redacted pages of her service record, in the part of her memory the Navy had supposedly erased when they declared her dead. And in saving him, she'd just handed Dr. Marcus Caldwell exactly what he needed to end her career. Caldwell moved through the hospital like a man possessed, his face flushed with something beyond anger, something more primal. He'd witnessed her hands inside another man's chest, her fingers performing a procedure that belonged in an OR with a surgical team, not in the hands of someone with a nursing license. But what really burned was the silence that followed. The residents had seen it. The attending physicians had seen it. The respiratory therapist, the charge nurse, 2 interns, they'd all watched her succeed where he would have called time of death. He reached his office and closed the door. His hand shook as he pulled up his contact list. 3 board members. He knew their personal numbers because he'd cultivated those relationships for exactly this kind of moment. His voice was steady when he called, controlled, measured, the voice of a concerned physician rather than a desperate man. "It's Marcus. We have a liability situation." He described what he'd witnessed in clinical terms: unauthorized procedure, scope violation, dangerous improvisation. He didn't mention that she'd saved the patient's life. He mentioned that she'd acted without authorization. He mentioned the risk to the hospital. He mentioned her pattern of insubordination. By the 3rd call, one board member was already talking about immediate action. The email to the chief of staff took 15 minutes. Caldwell typed with the precision of someone accustomed to being right. He cited hospital policy. He referenced the recent grand rounds where her competence had been questioned by multiple attending physicians. He framed her actions as reckless rather than heroic, dangerous rather than innovative. He requested a formal investigation into where she'd acquired unauthorized surgical training because no civilian nurse, no matter how experienced, should possess those skills. The implication hung in every word: something doesn't add up. Someone needs to investigate. He hit send at 3:08 p.m. The complaint to the State Nursing Board arrived at 4:23 p.m., this time with official hospital letterhead and his signature as ER director. He questioned her credentials. He demanded verification of her training history. He cited documented instances of her overstepping scope of practice. He requested immediate investigation and temporary suspension pending review. He made sure to mention that she'd performed a thoracotomy, he used the exact medical term, knowing it would alarm the board reviewers, without surgical training, without attending physician authorization, without the proper setting. The complaint read like it had come from someone protecting the public from a dangerous practitioner. It didn't read like revenge. That was the skill Caldwell possessed in abundance, the ability to dress up retaliation as institutional responsibility. Security found Laura at 5:14 p.m., just as she was finishing her charting. The head of security, a woman named Patterson who'd worked at St. Michael's for 18 years and knew every nurse's schedule by heart, looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Dr. Caldwell's orders," she said quietly, her jaw tight. "I'm sorry, Laura. I have to escort you out." Laura didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand to see the paperwork. She simply closed her computer, gathered her personal items from her locker, a spare pair of scrubs, a coffee mug, the tarnished challenge coin she'd carried in her pocket for 15 years, and stood up. Patterson's eyes softened with pity, which was somehow worse than anger. They walked through the ER together, past the nurses' station where conversations died mid-sentence. Past the residents who'd laughed during grand rounds. Past the attending physicians who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Caldwell stood by the main entrance, a printed letter in his hand. He read from it like a man performing a duty, his voice professionally detached: "Defective immediately. Your employment is terminated for gross violation of scope of practice, unauthorized medical procedures, and documented pattern of insubordination. You're banned from hospital premises pending state board investigation." The letter was dated today. It was signed by 3 people. Laura took it without looking at his face and signed the termination acknowledgement without reading it. She could have fought it. She could have called a lawyer. She could have demanded an investigation into Caldwell's motivations, into why the same procedure that would have made a surgical resident a hero had made her a liability when performed by a nurse. She could have exposed the truth about where her training came from because the truth would have raised questions that went all the way to the Pentagon. 16 operatives. Faces that had been burned across international news during a classified extraction that had gone catastrophically public. Names that the Navy had spent 15 years burying. A Master Chief Petty Officer named Laura Bennett who was supposed to be dead. The Navy's voice had been very clear, back in 2009, in a room that didn't have windows. The Admiral had used the word vanish. He'd used the word nobody. He'd explained that the extraction had compromised operational security, that someone had leaked to the media, that faces had been identified, that those 16 operatives were in danger. Laura Bennett was officially killed in action. Her records were being erased. Her service was being erased. Her existence was being erased. If she ever surfaced, if she ever acknowledged her past, if she ever drew attention to herself in any way that might connect those 16 faces to her, she would be endangering active operators. And so she became nobody. A ghost. A civilian. A person who had never existed at all. So she didn't fight Caldwell's termination. She signed the papers and walked out of St. Michael's at 5:56 p.m. into the thick Savannah humidity, past the visitors smoking by the entrance, past the ambulances idling in the bay, into a world that didn't know what she was. Patterson walked her to the exit and squeezed her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that Laura couldn't reciprocate because reciprocating would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant surfacing. The laundry room was empty at 6:03 p.m. Most of the day shift had already left. The night crew wouldn't arrive for another hour. Laura had changed into her personal clothes but still held the blood-stained scrubs, hers and pieces of the SEAL's blood, the residue of the thoracotomy. She loaded them into a washer with mechanical precision, the same kind of precision she'd once used to fold her dress blues before they were incinerated in a secure facility. The fabric was still warm from her body heat. She measured out the detergent exactly. She set the temperature. She pressed start and watched the water begin to fill. The challenge coin fell from her pocket. It hit the concrete floor with a sound impossibly loud in the empty room, a single metallic clink that seemed to echo off the walls like an accusation. She picked it up, ran her thumb across the worn edges, felt the weight of 15 years in her palm. The coin had been given to her by the commander of the extraction team, a SEAL named Marcus who was probably dead now, probably had been dead for years, probably was one of the faces the Navy had tried so hard to protect. She closed her fist around it and stood there, watching her scrubs tumble in the washer. The machine hummed and cycled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Her hand started to shake. Just slightly at first, a tremor in her fingers, barely noticeable. Then deeper, a trembling in her wrists and forearms that moved up through her shoulders. She pressed her back against the cold metal of the washer and let it happen because for the first time in 3 years at St. Michael's, for the first time since she'd become a civilian, no one was watching. There were no residents to maintain composure for. No attending physicians. No Caldwell waiting for her to break so he could cite it as evidence of emotional instability. No 16 operatives depending on her silence. Just an empty laundry room and a woman whose entire existence had just been erased for the second time in her life. The dryer buzzed, signaling that a previous load was done. Laura didn't move. She stood there with her fist clenched around the coin, her shoulders shaking, her breath coming in measured pulls because even alone, even broken, she couldn't quite let herself fall apart completely. The training wouldn't allow it. The discipline wouldn't allow it. The 15 years of being nobody wouldn't allow it. She was a ghost, and ghosts don't cry. They just stand in laundry rooms and watch their uniforms wash away. Exactly 3 hours after Laura walked out of St. Michael's with her reputation shattered and her career in flames, the parking lot erupted into controlled chaos that made every security guard on duty straighten their spine without understanding why. 2 Black Hawk helicopters cut through the Savannah sky with the precision of birds of prey, their rotor wash scattering leaves across the asphalt like a warning. Behind them, a convoy of 5 unmarked SUVs rolled through the hospital entrance with the kind of authority that doesn't require sirens or lights, the kind that makes people step aside before they're told to move. The lead vehicle stopped at the emergency entrance. The doors opened in perfect synchronization. A SEAL commander stepped out in dress blues that looked pressed with a knife edge, his insignia catching the afternoon light like polished steel, and walked directly into the ER without stopping at check-in or introducing himself. His voice carried through the waiting room like a radio frequency that only certain people could hear. "I need to speak with Phantom. Now." The veteran security guard, a retired Marine named Holloway who'd seen 30 years of uniforms, felt his chest tighten. His eyes widened. He breathed 2 words that changed the temperature of the room. "Master Chief Petty Officer, sir." The waiting room fell silent. Not the silence of people being quiet. The silence of people holding their breath. Behind the commander came 2 junior officers and a 2-star admiral in service dress whites, moving with the kind of purpose that turns a hospital corridor into something that feels smaller, tighter, more fragile. The admiral carried a tablet the way a priest carries scripture. He walked directly into the ER director's office where Dr. Caldwell sat reviewing his own emails, feeling the satisfied glow of a man who'd successfully destroyed a career that had threatened his authority. The admiral didn't ask permission to enter. He didn't introduce himself. He simply opened the tablet and began reading in a voice that carried through every open door in the hospital. "Laura Bennett. Master Chief Petty Officer, Navy Special Warfare Command. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire. Bronze Star with Valor. Second Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart sustained during Operation Enduring Freedom, Bagram Air Base, 2008. Declared KIA in 2009 to protect the operational security and ongoing concealment of 16 operators whose extraction she personally commanded. 15 years of exemplary service erased from all public records by direct order of the Department of Defense." He paused. He let each sentence settle like stones at the bottom of water. She was protecting her unit by becoming nobody. And you fired her for saving a patient's life. Caldwell's face had gone the color of wet concrete. The admiral closed the tablet and turned toward the door. The commander had already walked to room 12 where Petty Officer Garrett sat in a hospital gown, his cardiac monitor displaying the healthy sinus rhythm that Laura Bennett's hands had restored 8 hours earlier. The commander didn't speak. He simply nodded, and Garrett understood. He stood on legs that still felt uncertain, and he followed. They walked back to the waiting room where the room had become something like a held breath, where every person who'd laughed at Laura Bennett during grand rounds was now very carefully not moving. Garrett stood in front of the admiral, in front of the commander, in front of the security guard and the nursing staff and the residents who'd passed snide comments by the vending machines. His voice cracked like old leather as he spoke. "She died so I could live. Carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in her lung. 3 miles. And I didn't recognize her this afternoon because a head injury took her face from my memory." His hand moved to his forearm where her name sat in dark ink, the letters worn slightly fuzzy from years of checking, years of touching the tattoo without knowing why the name felt sacred. "She saved me twice. Once in Bagram when I was unconscious and bleeding out. And again today when my heart stopped. She saved me twice and asked for nothing. Not recognition. Not gratitude. Not even a name." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the waiting room erupted. Phones came out. The video was already there, Caldwell's Grand Rounds humiliation playing on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, the clip of him holding up her patient notes and mocking her competence while he stood beside him in fresh scrubs and perfect composure, not flinching, not responding, just absorbing his contempt like it was weather. The timestamp said the video had been posted at 4:13 p.m. It was now 7:23 p.m. In 2 hours and 36 minutes, it had accumulated 847,000 views. By midnight, it would reach 3 million. By morning, 4 million people would know that Dr. Marcus Caldwell had mocked a decorated Navy SEAL for having the spine to save another Navy SEAL's life. The hospital's social media exploded. News outlets started calling. Within 6 hours, the story had metastasized beyond the waiting room and into the bloodstream of medical social media, where threads began connecting dots, Caldwell's pattern of dismissing female staff. His reputation for vindictive performance reviews. The nurse he'd forced out 2 years earlier for inadequate bedside manner who'd actually discovered a surgical error he'd made and refused to let it pass. One by one, the pattern became visible. One by one, the narrative shifted from local embarrassment to national scandal. At noon the following day, Caldwell's former mentor at Johns Hopkins, a retired Navy Reserve officer named Dr. William Sterling who'd trained Caldwell 15 years earlier, released a statement from his office that would circulate through every medical institution in the country. "I am profoundly horrified to learn that Dr. Caldwell, whom I trained and mentored, demonstrated such callous disregard and contempt for a genuine American hero. Laura Bennett represents the very best of military medical training and combat composure. Dr. Caldwell's actions represent a fundamental failure of institutional leadership and human decency. I have personally contacted St. Michael's Board to disavow any connection to Dr. Caldwell's conduct and to demand a full investigation into his behavior toward not only Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett but toward all nursing staff under his supervision. I am ashamed to have trained him." The statement went viral on medical Twitter within 37 minutes. By 3 p.m., the hospital board had called an emergency session. Chairman Whitmore, a retired Navy commander who understood the weight of what he was hearing, opened by asking Caldwell directly, "Did you even look at her background check?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. He said nothing. 3 board members who'd taken his phone calls about the dangerous cowboy medicine and liability concerns were now very interested in clarifying that they'd been misled, that they'd acted in good faith based on false information, that they would be voting for immediate investigation. The Chief of Staff asked for Caldwell's resignation at 5 p.m. Caldwell refused. He threatened litigation. He claimed he'd been ambushed, that the video was edited, that he was being railroaded by military propaganda. Nobody was listening anymore. The board voted to terminate him at 6 p.m. The vote was unanimous. The State Medical Board closed its investigation into Laura Bennett with a formal written apology and a public commendation for her heroism and medical expertise. The State Nursing Board did the same. Within 72 hours, both boards had issued statements clarifying that Laura Bennett's medical credentials, background, and conduct were exemplary, and that any investigation into her practice had been initiated based on false pretenses and professional retaliation. Caldwell's medical license review began the following week. The conclusion came quickly: his license would be restricted to non-clinical education only. No patient contact. No clinical oversight. No authority in any hospital in the state. The minimum wage teaching position at Savannah Community College, CPR certification for anyone with $75 and an afternoon to spare, was the only option left. But that wasn't the worst part for him. That was just the professional catastrophe. His wife filed for divorce on day 18. The house in the historic district went up for sale at a 40% loss within 2 months. His reputation had become the kind of stain that doesn't wash out, the kind that follows you into grocery stores, into restaurants, into the mirror every morning. He taught CPR to community college students in a fluorescent-lit classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation, demonstrating chest compressions on a rubber dummy named Rescue Annie, showing these students how to save a life with the kind of detached precision that came from having once believed he'd earned the authority to decide whose life was worth saving and whose wasn't. 6 months after her termination, Laura Bennett stood on the deck of a naval destroyer cutting through the Atlantic with the morning sun turning the water into hammered copper. She wore her dress blues for the first time in 15 years, the uniform that fit her like it had been waiting for her to grow into it. The shoulders fell exactly where they should. The rows of medals on her chest caught the light with the authority of truth. Around her neck hung a silver star on a blue ribbon, and beside her stood Petty Officer Garrett and the 15 other operators who owed her their lives, their families, their futures. The tarnished challenge coin rested in a shadow box in her new office at Naval Special Warfare Command, finally retired from the pocket where it had lived for 15 years, worn smooth by fingers that needed to touch something real, something that proved she'd existed before the Navy erased her. The coin sat beside her silver star, beside her bronze stars, beside photographs of 16 operators who were alive because a Master Chief Petty Officer had chosen to die so they could vanish into new identities, new lives, new versions of themselves. Caldwell taught CPR to students who didn't know his name and wouldn't have cared if they did. Sometimes late at night, he searched for her online: Laura Bennett Navy SEAL, Laura Bennett Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, and found only articles about heroes and sacrifice, about the kind of courage that doesn't need titles or recognition, about the quiet person in the room who might be holding everything together while louder voices tear it apart. The waiting room at St. Michael's hung a photograph in the ER hallway. Not an official portrait. A candid shot of Laura standing in the threshold between the trauma bay and the corridor, her face partially turned away, her hand steady as surgical steel, the kind of image that captures something true about a person, not what they want you to see, but what they actually are. The caption beneath read, Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, United States Navy. In service of those who cannot serve themselves. If you've ever been underestimated by someone with a title and no substance, if you've ever seen someone's quiet competence dismissed as inadequacy, if you've ever wondered whether the truth could ever catch up to the lie, I'll subscribe to see more stories about the people institutions try to erase and the impossible moments when the truth finally surfaces. Like this video. Share your own story in the comments about a time you proved someone wrong about who you really are. And let me know. Would you have fought back, or would you have done exactly what Laura did, stayed invisible until the moment everything changed?